The committee will come to order, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Members, we left off during consideration of H.R. 5861, the Jobs and Opportunity with Benefits and Services for Success Act. Are there further amendments to the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute? Dr. Davis, what purpose do you seek recognition? Gentleman has an amendment to Mr. Roscom.
I reserve a point of order.
Point of order has been reserved. The clerk will distribute the amendment, and I ask the gentleman to suspend while the clerk distributes. Dr. Davis, you're recognized to speak on your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, TANF is about children. About 2/3 of TANF recipients are children, and most are children under the age of 12, with a very large percent being young children under age 6. Only 1.4 million families receive income support, yet half of TANF cases are child only. Unfortunately, this Republican bill does not address some of the key problems facing poor children in Illinois. The basic assistance level of TANF in Illinois is 25% of the federal poverty level. This is especially shameful when we realize that 50% of the federal poverty level is the definition of extreme poverty. So in Illinois, we only cover half of the level of extreme poverty. This level is bad in and of itself, but it's even worse when you realize that children in poverty are significantly more likely to experience chronic health problems, leading to unexpected and costly doctor visits that undermine work, especially low-level entry jobs. To add insult to injury, Illinois immediately reduces benefits as soon as a struggling parent begins to work. Rather than using aid to stabilize a child's family, the state destabilizing the family's ability to provide housing and food supplies. Indeed, a high percentage of TANF participants in Illinois live in shelters. Policymakers and child advocates like the Shriver Center in Illinois are fighting to improve child well-being by increasing the value of TANF grants to the level of extreme poverty, a level that would help a single mom move out of a shelter and pursue economic security. This income sounds small, but it is a powerful research that shows an increase in family income of as little as $3,000 per year when a child is developing is associated with a 17% increase in the child's future earnings. My amendment would create a bonus program to states that invest in assistance levels that improve child well-being, one, by providing family grants and a child-only grants at a minimum threshold of 50% of the federal poverty level, and continuing assistance for at least 6 months before reducing benefits to promote child well-being. Further, my amendment would give states the authority to develop modified employment ability plans for recipients caring for a family member with a disability or chronic health conditions. A single mom doesn't decide when an asthma attack, diabetic complication, or sickle cell episode occurs. This amendment would allow greater flexibility for caregivers to meet their children's health needs without sanction. Also, my amendment would flat out prohibit sanctions for caregivers if the difficulties with work stem from their children's chronic health problems. Finally, it would ensure that Any education assistance a child receives, such as for attending a private school or a Pell Grant for college, does not penalize the family's TANF benefits. These are common sense steps to promote child well-being and ensure we put children first. Any cost associated with protecting vulnerable families would be offset with the minor increase in the corporate rate, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Mr. Roscoe?
Mr. Chairman, I insist on my point of order that the amendment is not germane to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The amendment violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, because this Jobs for Success Act reauthorizes the program with improvements to help families get back to work. This amendment codifies the Internal Revenue Code by raising the corporate tax.
Thank you. Does the gentleman offering the amendment wish to speak on the point of order, Dr. Davis?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it is my feeling and position that this amendment and its pay for falls squarely within the jurisdiction of this committee. Consequently, I maintain that this amendment is germane and merits full consideration. Child health is a significant barrier to employment for poor single mothers. A recent study by the American Academy of Pediatrics documents that children in poverty are much more likely to experience chronic health problems such as asthma and ADHD. Further, poor children with asthma and ADHD were significantly more likely to have another chronic condition like developmental delays, autism, depression, behavior issues, or even epilepsy. The bill before us does not direct states to be flexible for the 92% of single moms trying to work and jump through dozens of hoops to provide their efforts to states while they must care for the health needs of their children. This bill increases their burdens. Health disparities for the Black community are great. To ignore the health challenges faced by poor children, and specifically by poor Black children, is unacceptable. These families suffer greater costs to address these health barriers. Grants that equal 25% of the federal poverty level are unbelievable. They might make policymakers feel like they're doing something, but they're not helping the 92% of single moms in Illinois and throughout the nation. When we consider the health needs of these children and the inability of their moms to work because of child care and health care needs, it is my feeling that this amendment is indeed germane and merits the consideration of this committee to meet the needs of the poor.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. I am prepared to rule. I will tell you this, though. We share your desire to promote child well-being in the Jobs Act and that we are considering. 40% of those children or those families receiving welfare cash assistance are child only. And so there is no time limit or work requirement for their parents. Also, there is already leeway in the program for parents caring for a disabled child or those with special needs. And the final point is, we know from the 96 reforms that were bipartisan. We saw a dramatic increase in child well-being because it lifted so many families out of poverty, including lifting children from African-American families out of poverty and into sustained success. So we share your concerns, and we think the underlying bill addresses it in a very serious way. So the amendment is not germane to the amendment in nature substitute because it violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, introducing subject areas not an amendment, and amending the Internal Revenue Code by raising the corporate tax rate. The point of order is sustained. The amendment is not in order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would respectfully appeal the ruling of the chair.
Mr. Roscoe?
I move to table.
Questions on the motion to table the appeal of the chair's ruling. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair is the ayes have it. The motion table is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute?
Chairman,
Dr. Davis, for what purpose?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Dr. Davis has an amendment at the desk. Mr. Roscom, you reserve a point of order?
Mr. Chairman, I do.
A point of order has been reserved. The clerk will distribute the amendment, and I ask the gentleman to suspend while the clerk distributes.
Is this number 9? Yeah. 8. This is 8. So we gotta do 9 and 10.
Dr. Davis, you're recognized to speak on your amendment, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this bill does not address the problems with TANF in Illinois. When Illinois and our country struggle with opiate addiction, the Republican bill continues to exclude people with substance abuse convictions from TANF. When we heard from witness after witness about the need to help returning citizens overcome their multiple barriers to employment, this bill fails to focus states on the complex needs of these potential workers, nor does it encourage states to provide workforce development to non-custodial fathers. Helping remove employment barriers for returning citizens and non-custodial parents promises to promote economic well-being, reduce poverty, and increase labor force participation. This bill fails to remove the barriers faced by millions of family caregivers, like unrealistic work requirements, time limits, and asset tests meant for younger workers, not for nearly retired grandparents. Many members of this committee live in states with large numbers of kinship caregivers, states like Illinois, Texas, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee. This bill fails to help these caregivers. The Republican bill does not require states to improve their standards to address domestic and sexual violence among TANF participants, nor does it lift the punitive bans on assistance to unwed teen parents who are not in school, nor the ban on teens who aren't living with an adult, leaving homeless youth and former foster youth out in the cold. The Republican bill fails to include basic due process protection to ensure that TANF recipients are not inappropriately denied, sanctioned, or kicked off of benefits. In Illinois, about 40% of TANF recipients are kicked off of benefits each month, due partly to minor violations, a late hours report, a missed signature, or missed work due to a sick child. My amendment would fix these oversights and improve protections for vulnerable families by extending TANF to parents with substance abuse convictions, establishing a workforce development program for returning citizens and non-custodial parents, improving TANF supports and removing barriers for family caregivers, strengthening TANF for domestic violence victims, removing the bans of assistance to unwed teen parents who are not in school and to teens not living with an adult, and establishing basic due process protections for TANF recipients prior to sanction. This amendment is supported by Generations United, a fabulous organization that champions the needs of grandparent caregivers. These ideas should not surprise the majority, given that they come from bills long referred to this committee. My kinship caregiver bill, my fatherhood bill, Congresswoman Moore's RISE Act. I must recognize Ms. Moore for her outstanding leadership in policies to improve TANF for vulnerable families, including some of the ideas in the Republicans' own bill, such as making child poverty a TANF goal. My amendment would promote economic well-being for vulnerable families, and any cost associated with protecting vulnerable families would be offset with a minor increase in the corporate tax rate. And
thank you, Dr. Davis. Mr. Roskin?
Mr. Chairman, I make a point of order to the amendment because it's not germane to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The amendment violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, because this Jobs for Success Act reauthorizes the program with improvements to help families get back to work. This amendment modifies the Internal Revenue Code by raising the corporate tax rate.
Thank you. The gentleman offering the amendment wish to speak on the point of order. Dr.
yes,
Davis?
Mr. Chairman, I would. Mr. Chairman, this amendment and its pay for fall squarely within the jurisdiction of this committee. Consequently, I maintain that this amendment is germane and merits full consideration. How can this committee talk about helping people struggling with opioid addiction with the bill before us and continue to exclude people with felony drug convictions? The federal government should take the lead to tell states that are helping engage individuals who've struggled with addiction to find work, which is important for the economic well-being of families and for our overall economy. How can this committee reject Mr. Neal's amendment to truly invest in workforce development? My amendment would follow his lead by establishing a workforce development program focused on returning citizens and non-custodial parents. Successfully helping these groups of parents become economically stable will do much to help families and our national economy. How can this committee say that this bill is strong when it fails to help the tens of millions of grandparents caring for their grandchildren? It doesn't remove the barriers to TANF for these families. If the child welfare world, we encourage families to care for siblings by giving them the same amount of money per child, but not in TANF. So a grandmom who wants to keep her grandbabies out of foster care seeks TANF and is rewarded by reduced assistance, even though she's keeping siblings together, which improves their well-being. How can this committee say that this is the strongest bill when it still sanctions teen parents because they aren't living with an adult, ignoring the high percentage of homeless youth? This bill does some good things, but it's too incomplete. It does not meet the needs of the poor in Illinois or this nation, and it needs substantial revision to do so. Therefore, Mr. Chairman, I maintain that my amendment is germane and merits the consideration of this committee to meet the needs of the poor.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. I am prepared to rule, but before I do that, I would note that the underlying Jobs for Success Act actually improves protections for families that you are concerned about. For example, it allows states to work with individuals with substance abuse and mental health problems through referrals as part of their individual opportunity plan. Remember, all means all. Everybody who's work eligible will have a plan they agree to work them into that job and keep them there. It also allows jobs funding to be transferred to the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, provide better access to workforce programs as you desire. And then finally, it redirects states to spend at least 25% of federal and state dollars on the support services you are seeking to help get them into work. So the point being, the amendment is not germane to the amendment nature substitute because it violates House Rule 16, Clause 7 by introducing subject areas not in the amendment in amending the Internal Revenue Code by raising the corporate tax rate. Therefore, the point of order is sustained. The amendment is not in order.
Mr. Chairman, I respectfully appeal the ruling of the chair.
Gentleman appeals ruling chair. Mr. Roskin, you move to table the appeal?
I do.
Questions on the motion to table the appeal of the chair's ruling. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Any chair, the ayes have it. The motion table is agreed to. Are there further amendments? An amendment to the nature of a substitute. Oh, Ms. Chu, you're, for what purpose did the gentlelady seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The gentlelady has an amendment. Mr. Roskin? Point of order has been reserved. The clerk will distribute the amendment. I ask the gentlelady to suspend while the clerk distributes. Gentlelady is recognized to speak on her amendment.
Mr. Chair, I move to introduce this amendment along with my colleague, Congressmember Crowley, to strengthen the child care provisions of this bill. We've had a lot of discussion in this committee and this markup about child care, and many of my colleagues have shined a light on the fact that one of the main barriers for families looking to participate in the workforce is access to child care. Today, most young children in the United States have parents who work outside the home, and the costs can be overwhelming. In my home state of California, child care costs are an average of over $13,000 a year, which is difficult for even middle-income families to bear, let alone those who are low-income or living in poverty. Currently, fewer than 15% of income-eligible children have access to child care in California, with an estimated 1.3 million eligible children not being served. In addition, over 400,000 children are on wait lists due to the unavailability of child care providers. I'd also like to point out that the 92% of single mothers who are TANF recipients are working. The time that children spend on taking care of their children, cooking, cleaning, running errands, and taking care of other family members do work, but it is work that is severely undervalued. And that time and labor should be accounted for when looking for solutions to help women achieve economic stability. The underlying legislation falls significantly short on ensuring that states invest more dollars in child care and not impede a state's ability to use TANF dollars for child care. The bill puts a 50% cap on the amount of TANF funds that can be transferred to the Child Care and Development Block Grant. In addition, this legislation does not include child care as a core purpose of the program. Instead, this bill requires that the state spend 25% of the grant on cash assistance, case management, work supports and activities, and non-recurring short-term benefits. So my amendment would eliminate this 50% cap on transferring TANF funds to the Child Care and Development Block Grant. While states may not choose to use more than 50% of their TANF funds for child care purposes, they should not be barred from doing so. So this is a program that could therefore get much more investment and help parents in maintaining their steady employment. My amendment would also add child care to the list of core purposes to encourage states to use TANF dollars to help parents successfully enter the workforce and sustain employment. According to testimony provided at a Human Resources Subcommittee hearing, lower-income parents often face considerable challenges in entering the workforce. These challenges include caring for young children, a lack of stable and affordable child care that matches the needs of work schedules, and chronically ill children. If we are serious about helping families become work-ready, then we must put more pressure on states to invest TANF dollars in quality child care spending instead of diverting funds to other programs. My amendment would help to achieve that goal, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Bishop, you're recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the Chairman and Chairman Smith for their hard work on this and for giving this committee the opportunity to address this issue. And I also want to thank Ms. Chu for those words. I do believe that we have an agreement on the importance of child care in this process. And I'm glad we're having this discussion today. As original co-sponsor of the Jobs for Success Act, I'm grateful that this legislation includes many meaningful reforms that will help families get off welfare and get back to work. Specifically with regard to child care, I think we can all agree that child care is an important work support for low-income working families that can help people return to the workforce where they otherwise wouldn't. That's why I, along with my colleague Lynn Jenkins, introduced H.R. 5835, the Improving Access to Child Care Act, which increases the resources available for child care. I was also glad to see that this legislation was incorporated into the underlying bill that we're considering today, and my provision is paid for by repurposing more than $600 million to the Child Care Entitlement to States portion of the Child Care Development Fund, and that's an increase of 24%. Needless to say, this will improve access to child care for families on welfare and will ultimately help parents re-enter the workforce and provide more for their families. Now, I want to also mention that when we talk about funding and funding levels, in total, with the new investment and changes that are made in this bill, the annual amount of federal funds to support child care adds up to more than $16 billion. And if that's not enough, the GAO published a study last year finding that not less than 9 federal programs provide support exclusively for early learning or child care, and an additional 35 programs permit funds to be used to pay for child care. That same report found that, not surprisingly, many of these programs overlap, provide duplicative services, and are fragmented across multiple federal agencies. So we've made significant investment in the bill for child care, and certainly we should not ignore the fact there are significant federal investment out there already made by these other programs. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Mr. Dogg, you're recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think this is one of the most important amendments that we are considering on this bill. What could be more central to assuring that the 92% of families that are led by a single mom who are receiving temporary assistance for needy families today can provide a pathway to a job if the child is not cared for? It's really incredible that core purposes under this bill do not include child care. I'm blessed to have a grandson who's just a little over 2, and he is a ball of energy, following 3 granddaughters. And it takes a tremendous amount of effort to keep up with him and to entertain him when he's at our house. And the thought that a single mom who probably doesn't have a very good history of work is going to get a job and not have child care for young children or even older children that get up to middle school level and are going to be left on the street, are going to be latchkey kids, not only is likely to discourage work, but to the extent that that mom goes out and tries to get a job, it's likely to create many other types of social problems that we will have to deal with later because there's not quality child care for that child. Now, let's talk about the funding that was referred to yesterday and was just referred to by Mr. Bishop. The $600 million that is going to be provided under the bill that he referred to. The only problem with that is that for a number of states, given the way Republicans are funding this bill, they're actually going to reduce the amount of money that is available for child care because they're taking the money from the contingency fund. So if, for example, you live in New York State, like Mr. Reed and Mr. Crowley, you're going to have, under this proposal that they were just boasting of, you're going to have $237 million lost. If you live in Missouri, like Mr. Smith, you're going to have a $12 million loss in Missouri because of the way this is funded. If you live in Arizona, like Mr. Schweikert, a $9 million loss. There are a number of other states that are using their contingency fund right now for child care, and they come up with less money under this bill than they have today. A net loss not being able to provide additional child care. There was also reference to the fact, and this is part of this mythology, that there's just so much money out there for child care, it's just a question of grabbing it. And one of the references that was made yesterday was to the money that was put in the omnibus. The problem with that is that only 1 in 6 eligible children receive any federal child care assistance. The National Women's Law Center estimates that there are 400,000 fewer children that are receiving child care assistance now, or actually it was in 2016, I think they did their study, than a decade before that. We not only didn't keep up with the needs of children and recognizing the inflation in child care costs, but 400,000 fewer. And the omnibus, fortunately, did deal with some of that. It provided an increase that will cover 151,000 children. So while that's some modest progress, it doesn't even meet half of the gap of children that are eligible for services and are not receiving them. I just think that it is vital that we address this child care need. I know that there are women out there, some men, but mostly women, who are faced with the challenge of, do we pay the rent and the utility bill, the health care bills, or do we try to find child care? And many of them will not be able to find child care resources unless they're provided as a core purpose of this bill. It's essential that we provide more resources for child care, that we recognize it as an area where the states that are devoting so little money now, in many cases, to child care are asked to do more. What Ms. Chu is suggesting, what she is recommending in this amendment, would significantly improve the bill, and to pass legislation without adequate child care is to create the same type of false promise that we created in passing this bill in 1996 without writing it in a way that would assure a genuine path to work with the support necessary to get there. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Smith, you recognize to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and colleagues. It's again, I think we are heading in a similar direction. I appreciate the intent of the amendment, but I think we need to be careful here, and that is to understand that if we put everything into child care, there won't be resources left for other, I think, very helpful services, whether it's transportation, various forms of assistance, case management, work support, and supportive services. So the hearings that we had on this, we learned that it's not just child care, but it's also about helping the entire family and the dynamic challenges that these families face. So certainly I mentioned yesterday that we have increased resources for child care, as it's been mentioned several times throughout this markup, and that we do need to be careful, though, that we don't end up without the resources for other supportive wraparound services. So let's keep to the task at hand here, and ultimately get some policy out there that does help.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
And not in an argumentative way, but just trying to understand, why is child care excluded from the definition of core purposes?
Well, I think when we look at, the various objectives, certainly child care is still very important because we focus on that. Now,
shouldn't it be defined as a core purpose under
gentleman,
the statute?
the gentleman has the time. Are you still yielding to Mr. Dogga? Are you?
Yeah, that's really the extent of my inquiry, is why not make it a core purpose? It has been traditionally viewed as one of the core purposes of TANF.
Well, I think that when you look at the number of employers who actually help with child care themselves, but getting someone in that job position first, and utilizing many of these resources to do so, the child care then can wrap around the fact that there are needs for these families who might already be in a position of work, So the needs are actually being met without getting into too many details of definitions and limitations of how the resources can be used.
Will the gentleman yield again?
Yes.
So I agree that some employers provide child care, some religious institutions provide child care, many nonprofits, but there's still a really big gap out there, and the purpose of putting child care in as a core goal of TANF is to ensure that the states are devoting more adequate resources to it, and I would just ask, as you move forward, to consider including it, because if we don't include it, I really think it will significantly impair our shared goal of getting more people to work.
Thank you. And would the gentleman yield for just 10 seconds?
Yes.
Just a correction. I think Mr. Doggett said that child care is a core service today. It's not. There are no core work services. That's the whole goal of this, is to really reserve and drive down the work services, and then we get to child care in a stronger way by increasing the cap, taking the slush fund away, and devoting that to child care activities. I think, as Mr. Smith said, we are very much in agreement on the need for it and increasing it dramatically. It's just how we're doing it. There's some.
Will the chairman
Will
yield?
the gentleman yield?
Will the chairman yield?
Mr. Smith has.
Reclaiming my time.
Okay.
Mr. Smith, will you yield?
One moment, please. My time is limited here. It's important to note, as the chairman just touched on a little bit, that we increased the cap from 30% to 50%. So again, I sense that we're heading in a similar direction, and I don't want to get overly prescriptive in the bill here, because I think we still need to have some flexibility. But holding the states accountable for producing results, I think, is probably one of the most important, call it a core goal of this legislation. Again, increasing resources to child care is what is contained in the bill, other legislation that we have recently passed as well. And so let's, I think, utilize that for the betterment of folks in need. Gentlelady from California, I would yield.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment briefly on the idea that employers provide child care. The vast majority of employers do not, and the vast majority of employers in this country are small businesses who cannot. As a member of Congress, just my own personal experience, I signed up for child care through the House, through my employer, 2 years in advance of my son's birth date. Never got child care. So even for employers that do provide it, the need far exceeds what is provided. And I think it's important to express that point of view, because I think many people don't understand just how difficult
My time has expired.
it is to find child care. And we really need to wake up to that fact, and I will yield back. Thank the gentleman for yielding.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Crowley, you recognize to speak on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague, Ms. Chu, for joining me in this important amendment. I must say, it's a shame our colleagues on the other side are choosing yet again to draft sweeping changes to national policies behind closed doors without any input from Democrats and away from the view of the American people, but for this markup. But after a partisan tax bill and a partisan farm bill, I guess I shouldn't be all that surprised. Mr. Chairman, as my colleagues indicated, the Chu-Crowley amendment would alter this bill in two important ways. First, it would make child care one of the core services provided by the TANF program. And second, it would remove the 50% limit on federal TANF spending for child care, giving states like New York the ability to put even more additional resources towards it. In over half the states, the cost of a year of child care is more than a year of college tuition. And that gets so much more attention than does child care and the costs and the exorbitant costs. And in every state, child care costs are higher than rent, and in many cases, they exceed mortgage payments. For working parents, that's a pill too big to swallow. If the goal of the TANF program is to provide some support to help working families get back on their feet and get to work, we need to give them the tools to succeed at work. That starts with one of the most important hurdles, affording child care. And as the author of the Child First Act, which would greatly increase funding for child care and make changes to improve the quality thereof, this is an extremely important issue for me personally. So I find it difficult to understand why my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would advance reforms, as they call them, to move more individuals off TANF and into the workplace, while at the same time making it harder for families to go to work and to afford child care at the same time. I know my good friend and colleague from New York is one of the problem solvers, Mr. Reed. If there was ever a problem that needs to be solved, this is a problem that needs to be solved. And why and how Mr. Reed could vote for this in cutting off funds for TANF, for child care in the state of New York, where the flexibility of the contingency accounts are used for that purpose, is beyond anything that I can imagine. I can't understand how any New Yorker, Democrat or Republican, could vote for this bill, because it will hurt working people, people who are trying to work in New York State. Dare I suggest that perhaps you all being a little bit disingenuous. Could it be that Republicans aren't really interested in helping people succeed, but just want to advance an extreme ideological agenda?
Mr. Crowley, the rules of the House say a member may not impugn the motives of another member, and so do not address your remarks about Mr. Reed or any other member.
No, I was describing that to all of you.
Make your point by staying within the rules of decorum.
It was not to any one particular member, it was to all of you.
Excuse me, you represented Mr. Reed specifically.
No, I did address Mr.
Make
Reed.
your point within
I
the
did
rules
address
of the
Mr. Reed,
committee.
Mr. Chairman, specifically, but then after that, to my prepared remarks, was addressed to all of you.
Mr. Crowley,
Could it be that the Republicans aren't really interested in helping people succeed, but just want to advance an extreme ideological agenda? That's the question I ask. An agenda that dictates government shouldn't do anything to help Americans who fall on hard times and need a little bit of a help. I'll yield to you in a moment. I think that's what's really going on here. But I invite my Republican colleagues to prove me wrong. Prove me wrong, and vote for this important amendment. Show some bipartisanship. We saw none on the tax bill. None of it. Here's an opportunity to show the American people that we can work in a bipartisan spirit to help get people back to work, but give them the ability to afford to go back to work. Support this amendment and give low-income Americans the help they need to succeed. And I'll be happy to yield time to my friend from Texas.
And I could understand why you would reference Mr. Reed and yourself, because as I read this, and we've had no response from our Republican colleagues on this, New York State, instead of getting more to help close the child care gap, under this bill, under their great reform, $237 million less cut, a $237 million cut in New York State, and a cut in one state after another. One of the ones I omitted before, $29 million from Mr. Reichert's state of Washington, $12 million from Missouri, $2.3 million from South Carolina, cuts in Massachusetts, in North Carolina, in Delaware, in Alabama.
Reclaiming my time, let me just say, I know there's an awful lot of soul-searching going on that side of the aisle. I heard that after the tax bill. But after the SALT provisions and the assault on New York State and its budget, and now this, I don't know how any New Yorker could vote for this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Kelly, you're recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank the Chairman. Yesterday, we heard quite a bit, and Ms. Sanchez brought up several times, but most members on the other side brought up this fact. It said that 92% of TANF recipients are single moms. First of all, that fact shouldn't surprise any of us, given the fact that TANF eligibility is for needy families with dependent children. Secondly, the Jobs for Success Act puts considerable resources towards child care because we do understand that fact. But there's a big part of the equation that's missing here. It's fathers. Where are the fathers? Why are there 92% of TANF recipients single moms? In 1996, there was a heavy focus on single mothers, but TANF purposes speak to the responsibility of both parents, the mother and the father. And we're trying to strengthen that. And it's often been said that the greatest gift a father can give his children is to be a great husband to their mother. In the last 22 years, we pushed men to the side and not held them accountable. As a result, there were 7 million that have disappeared from the workforce. Many of those are due to opioid addiction, which is the most common among young single and divorced men. Never married and divorced adults account for 71% of opioid deaths. Meanwhile, there are 5 million child support cases that are not being collected because the father isn't working. We need to bring fathers back into the equation because they are needed. There's just something about a loving family, a mother and a father, together raising their children that forms a healthy America. And when we continue to break down the basic factor of what makes us a great people is the fact that we are mothers and fathers raising our children. We are husbands and wives working together. The fathers outside the home can receive the same work support sustenance that mothers do, but there's a lot more to be done. The load for a single mom is enormous, and I agree with that. To help her, we have made investments in child care, but we are also setting the expectation on the fact that fathers need to do their share too in raising their children. There's something wrong in America when 92% of single moms are raising children on their own. It didn't happen that way by coincidence. There was a father involved, there is a husband involved, and then there's a shared responsibility that I don't think we as a nation, regardless of your political stance, whether you're an R or a D, this is about we raising our children the right way. And it does take a mother and a father doing it. There's no way in my mind that I can somehow accept the fact that a father can walk away from raising his child with the mother of that child. It just doesn't make sense. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Levin, you're recognized to speak on the amendment.
I think, if I may say so respectfully, what we've just heard is a strong reason to support this amendment. What you raise is a larger issue. But the problem we have is that for the kids who need help, your speech doesn't help them. And look, I went back over the history of this. We, over the years since 1996, have offered legislation to raise child care support. Mr. Cardin had a proposal. We Democrats offered an amendment in 2005 to increase child care funding by $11 billion over 5 years. And it hasn't succeeded. You've resisted. And the result is that a small percentage of the kids who need child care help get it. And so, Mr. Bishop, I guess he's not here now, but you better face up to this in the coming days, and everybody else does. You take money from the contingency fund and put it into child care. We debated that yesterday. Essentially, you're leaving no money there when the next downturn comes. Zero. And there will be another downturn. So again, you've robbed Peter to pay Paul. And look, goodwill is important, and I respect the effort to improve the structure by moving away from what was essentially a punitive provision, and the way we've now framed it, it's more constructive. And there's an emphasis on providing assistance to help move people to work. But that doesn't work if there isn't adequate child care. And so, Mr. Chairman, you said yesterday you were willing to sit down and talk about, on a bipartisan basis, an effort to improve this bill. A major way to improve it will be to face up to the defect in terms of child care in this country. Compared to many industrial nations, we, in terms of child care, are in a state of poverty. That's just a reality. And so when a small percentage who need child care receive it, there's a problem even when welfare reform is restructured in a step forward, because for the people who need child care, we're still moving backwards. So, Mr. Chairman, you're going to vote this down. I suggest before you bring this to the floor, if that's your intention, that we have a serious discussion about the deficit in child care funding in this legislation. And if not, you can expect that we will raise this in dramatic form. And we will talk about families in particular who need child care who can't receive it. You can expect that. And that isn't our preference. So this is an amendment in the best of goodwill. And vote it down, but I urge that there be an effort in the next weeks to take up this child care issue, Mr. Chairman, because we'll go into the history of the refusal of the majority party to face up to this, and you can expect it to be done in very effective ways on our part, because go home yourself, talk to employers how many provide child care. It's a tiny percentage. So face up to it. Face up to it and work with us. If not, we'll have a strong battle on the floor. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Roscom.
Thank you, Mr. Roscom, and thank Mr. Chairman. I think it's important to note that instead of child care as a core work activity, we actually increase the cap from 30 to 50% on the amount of TANF funds states can transfer to the Child Care and Development Fund, which is our country's primary program that provides access to child care for low-income working families. This is the way to help with child care in a transparent and accountable way. Under current law, states spend about $1.3 billion in TANF dollars on child care, but there's no accountability or transparency for how those dollars are actually being spent. So we don't know if that child care meets the basic health and safety standards or even how many families are being served. So this bill would protect what would be maybe called a black box approach to funding child care. It would prohibit the black box and instead increase the amount that can be transferred up to 50% of a state's allocation, or a potential $8 billion per year. So this ensures that all TANF dollars for child care are subject to health and safety protections, and data is actually available on the number of children served by those dollars. Let me also point out, in terms of process, that before every step along the way of putting this bill together, there was outreach to work together. Before the discussion draft, before the hearing, before the bill introduction, before the markup, before the chairman's amendment, and there's still indication that we can work together on this. We can do this in a bipartisan fashion. I think already there is some pretty good evidence that there is bipartisan opportunity to work together here without some of the statements that I think undermine the opportunity to work together. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. So votes are imminent, and our thinking is after Dr. Davis, we will close out this amendment. I understand we have one more. Let's see if we can push through. If not, we will reconvene after votes. We'll see if we can finish out. Dr. Davis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I simply want to emphasize that I strongly support the gentlelady's amendment. My state, the state of Illinois, has prioritized child care, and this bill will pull the rug from under it. Further, I'm shocked that this bill basically says that diverting needy single moms from TANF is a core purpose, but child care is not. And nothing could be more important than child care. I urge passage of the amendment and yield back.
Thank you, Dr.
Gentlemen, give me some time.
Yes.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, the gentleman give me just some time. Let me just point out for the record, for my colleague, Mr. Smith, I am the sponsor and have been the sponsor, the lead sponsor of the Child First Act for many years in the House of Representatives. Not a single Republican from the Ways and Means Committee reached out to my office on this issue. Never once. Never once. So please don't come here and talk about how we had ample time and opportunity to weigh in on this issue when not a single member nor their staff ever reached out to my office on an issue that I've been involved in for many years?
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Dr. Davis actually controls the time. Dr. Davis, do you yield to Mr. Renacci?
Yes.
I was just asked, did you come to my office and ask? Because it.
Can you reclaim your time? And would you yield to me? I am not in the majority. I don't know what the schedule is of this. Let me finish. You are in control. Your side is in control. You are in charge of what's put before this committee, not me. After November, we may have a different discussion then, but until then, you're in charge. Your responsibility to talk to us as well.
Excuse me, you had a bill.
Gentleman has the time.
Dr.
Dr. Davis, do you yield to Mr. Renacci?
You had if you have a bill, I'd offer any time. Come see me and talk to me, but don't expect me to try and find out about it. I'd love to hear you. Come talk to
Will
me.
the gentleman reclaim his time?
Reclaiming my
Can you
time.
give it to me one more time?
One more time.
So we are on a path to
Mr.
coming
Chairman, let me
back
just
after
say
the votes.
that I have held numerous press conferences. It has been reported widely. Mr. Chairman, can I have some water, please, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, regular order, please.
It's also been widely reported in periodicals here on the Hill. It is a bill that has been submitted as a bill. So therefore, maybe you should do your homework and find out what some of the ideas on this side of the aisle are, since you're bankrupt on your side of the aisle for ideas. With that, I will yield back to the gentleman.
Claiming my time, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, introduce the record. Analysis that shows grant dollars per child in poverty are for New York, $2,852, for Texas, $300. For Connecticut, $2,728, for Florida, $644. For Illinois, $1,740 per child in poverty, for Alabama, $347, without objection. The question now is on agreeing the amendment offered by Mr. Crowley. Or all those in favor? Chu? Ms. Chu. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. A roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll. And this is on the Chu amendment.
Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Nunes? Mr. Nunes, no. Mr. Reichert? Oh, Mr. Reichert, no. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, no. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, no. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, no. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, no. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, no. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, no. Ms. Black? Mr. Reed? No. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Kelly? No. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, no. Ms. Nome? Mr. Holding? Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith, no. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, no. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, no. Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski, no. Mr. Curbelo? Mr. Curbelo, no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. LaHood? Mr. LaHood, no. Dr. Winstrup? Dr. Winstrup, no. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, yes. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, yes. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, yes. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, yes. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, aye. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, yes. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, yes. Dr. Davis? Dr. Davis, yes. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, aye. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, yes. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, yes. Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene, aye. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Nome? Mr. Holding? Mr. Holding, no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Thompson? Chairman Brady?
No.
Chairman Brady, no. Mr. Chairman,
Clerk will report the vote.
14 yeas, 22 nays.
There being 14 ayes and 22 noes, the amendment is not agreed to. Are there additional amendments to the amendment in nature to substitute? Dr. Davis, you're recognized for an amendment. Mr. Roskin reserves a point of order. Clerk will distribute the amendment. I ask the gentleman to suspend while the clerk distributes. We do have votes. We're trying to move it. We'll see. Gentleman's recognized on his amendment. Dr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've championed modernizing the fatherhood grants for over a decade via the Julia Carson Responsible Fatherhood and Healthy Families Act. Although H.R. 5861 extends the authorization of the fatherhood grants, it fails to modernize and expand these grants as past Republican bills have done. Responsible fatherhood programs strengthen families, improving the economic well-being of non-custodial parents, promotes responsible fatherhood, and helps those workers provide for their families. Fathers play a significant role in the development of their children, with research demonstrating that a supportive and involved father strengthens a child's emotional, physical, intellectual, and behavioral development. Children with positive relationships with fathers, even if they do not live in the same household, have stronger mental health, economic success, and academic achievement, with lower rates of youth delinquency, dropout, and teen pregnancy. Given the tremendous need for quality programs, my amendment would double the funding for fatherhood grants. Only 3 programs in Illinois currently get any fatherhood funding. The Haymarket Center in Chicago offers a wonderful program that helps low-income fathers recovering from substance addiction and to find quality employment. Due to limited federal funds, this high-caliber program hasn't received a federal fatherhood grant in years, nor has the Springfield Urban League, Fathers Who Care, the Children's Home and Aid Society, nor the Illinois Fatherhood Initiative. This amendment increases the upward mobility of custodial and non-custodial parents so they can actively participate in financial support and child rearing, as well as maintain positive, healthy, and nonviolent relationships with their children and co-parents. I urge passage of this amendment. It strengthens family relationships and is a tremendous aid to fathers, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Rossi, you recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I make a point of order that the amendment's not germane. It violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, because this Jobs for Success Act authorizes the program with improvements to help families get back to work. This amendment modifies the IRS code by raising the corporate tax.
I am prepared to rule. Does the gentleman wish to speak on the point of order?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, this amendment is paid for squarely within the jurisdiction of this committee. And as Mr. Kind so eloquently pointed out, this bill does little for fathers, so I would maintain that it is indeed germane and urge its passage.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. I am prepared. The rule amendment is not germane to amendment in nature substitute, as it violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, by amending the Internal Revenue Code by raising the corporate tax rate. Point of order is sustained. The amendment is not in order.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman, appeals ruling the chair. Mr. Roskin moves to table the appeal. Questions on the motion to table the appeal of the chair's ruling. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion to table is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman,
if there,
I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will report the vote.
You ready? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Nunes? Mr. Nunes, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith in Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Ms. Nome? Mr. Holding? Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski? Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbelo? Mr. Curbelo, aye. Mr. Bishop? I didn't hear him. Okay. Mr. LaHood? Mr. LaHood, aye. Dr. Winstrup? Dr. Winstrup, aye. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Doggett? Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, no. Dr. Davis? Dr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, no. Ms. Del Bene? Ms. Del Bene, no. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, no. Ms. Black? Ms. Nome? Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Chairman Brady?
Aye.
Chairman Brady, aye. Is Mr. Lewis and Mr. Doggett?
I voted.
All right.
How do you have me recorded?
Mr. Doggett?
Do you have me recorded?
I do not have you recorded.
No.
Mr. Doggett, no.
Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Lewis not here today? Oh. Clerk will report the vote.
22 yeas, 15 nays.
There being 22 ayes and 15 noes, the motion to table is agreed to. If there are no further amendments, questions on the adoption amendment in the nature of substitute, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Opinion chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 5861 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The questions on favorably reporting the bill H.R. 5861 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
Opinion chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 5861 is ordered favorably reported to the House. Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Reichert?
If the committee will come to order so the clerk can hear the votes.
Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska? Mr. Smith, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Aye. Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Aye. Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Kelly? Aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Renacci? Aye. Mr. Renacci, aye. Ms. Nome? Mr. Holding? Aye. Mr. Holding, aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Aye. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Rice? Aye. Mr. Rice, aye. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert, aye. Ms. Walorski? Aye. Ms. Walorski, aye. Mr. Curbelo? Aye. Mr. Curbelo, aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. LaHood? Mr. LaHood, aye. Dr. Winstrup? Aye. Dr. Winstrup, aye. Mr. Neal? No.
If I could ask the audience to quiet as well so we can hear the vote tally. Thank you.
Mr. Neal?
No.
Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Levin? No. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson? Okay. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? No. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley? No. Mr. Crowley, no. Dr. Davis? Dr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Higgins? Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell, no. Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene, no. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu, no. Ms. Black? Ms. Nome? Mr. Lewis? Mr. Thompson? Chairman Brady?
Aye.
Chairman Brady, aye.
You can head over.
Chairman Brady?
Clerk will report the vote.
22 yeas, 14 nays.
On this vote, the ayes are 22, the noes are 14. Motion's agreed to. H.R. 5861, Jobs for Success Act, as amended, is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, I ask the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. The members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.